El día de hoy hemos visto cómo la acción climática significa incrementar los compromisos progresivamente por parte de todos los actores de nuestra economía. Por esta razón, el día de hoy tenemos una conferencia patrocinada por Amundi Asset Management, nuestro Premier Partner, acerca de los compromisos para la neutralidad de carbono, que son los más ambiciosos e importantes. Es necesario conocer el contexto y los avances en esta materia a nivel mundial. Y en esta conferencia magistral se expondrá el camino para llegar a la meta de emisiones netas cero y los retos que tenemos que superar. Para brindar esta charla tenemos con nosotros a Timothée Jolin, Head of ESG Development and Advocacy Special Operations en Amundi Asset Management. Bienvenido, Timothée. Es un gusto tenerte en nuestro evento.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank Finanza Sustainable's MX for inviting me today. I'm honored to be speaking at the 2021 edition and focus my speech on net zero commitments. So I'll talk to you about Amundi's road to net zero, or better, the commitments we have made to ensure our company actively contributes to carbon neutrality objectives to be met by 2050 or sooner. This is particularly relevant today, as we are still exiting COP26 and as it is clear that private companies, among which financial actors, will have a key role to play in helping to close the ambition gap, the policy gap, and the financing gaps. So those three critical gaps. When you think with insight about Paris and the road to net zero, what gap remain? In 2015, 196 countries adopted the Paris Agreement with the core objective to keeping global average temperature rise to below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to keep it below 1.5. The thing is, we all know that the current emission reduction targets taken by countries under the framework of the Paris Agreement fall short of this objective. Seeing the glass half full, the International Energy Association issued a statement pointing that with the commitment made at the COP26 so far, the world could be on track for 1.8 degrees instead of the 2.7 degrees anticipated before the COP. This is good news, especially as China and the US took a major step to move in the right direction. Seeing the glass half empty, such commitments are not sufficient to meet the 1.5 degrees target and associated global neutrality by 2050. As a reminder, this global neutrality by 2050 is tantamount to reducing carbon emissions by 7% every year on average. And we have not yet reached peak CO2 emissions. So what investors can do, notably in terms of addressing the financing gap? It's true to reflect on the mobilization of the financial sector as very important, especially in the context of the preparation of the COP. This was indeed the first COP at which financial institutions had taken official collective engagement. The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which represents $130 trillion in capital across 450 financial institutions, announced that they committed to transforming the economy and achieving net zero. This is very much needed. From a climate mitigation standpoint only, there is an urgent need of an additional 1.6 to 3.8 trillions per annum to finance the energy transition. Overall, 56 trillions will be required in low carbon infrastructure to achieve net zero carbon. Now, if you look at climate adaptation needs, the UNEP considers the cost of adaptation could range between 140 billion and 300 billion US dollars annually by 2030. Now, focusing on developing countries, which will be the most affected by the climate crisis, adaptation cost could range from 280 billion to 500 billion US dollars annually by 2050. So, to get this capital mobilization which is needed, at Amundi we believe in blended finance, where one can use public money mixed up with private capital to encourage innovation. After the COVID crisis, public debts are already very high, and therefore public finance will not necessarily be sufficient. Private capital must therefore be leveraged and crowded in. We have had quite a few good experiences in launching public-private partnerships, notably in emerging markets and in the corporate debt space. we've had very promising partnerships with the IFC, launching the world's largest green bond fund focused in emerging markets in 2018, successfully addressing the gap between the low yield environment that one faces in developed markets and the extensive green infrastructure financing needs in developing countries. A few weeks ago, we announced the launch of a new fund, a new program in partnership with the IFC to mobilize up to $2 billion in private investment into emerging market sustainable bonds to support COVID-19 relief efforts and promote a green, resilient, and inclusive recovery from the pandemic. We also worked in partnerships with the EIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, all our institutional investors' clients, and welcome further initiatives to mobilize capital markets to support energy transition objectives, notably in emerging markets. The reason for that is that we believe asset owners and managers have a critical role to play. Actually, they're in a unique position to have what we believe to be a very significant impact. As I said, they can finance projects, helping closing the financing gap, but they can also engage the companies in which they invest, helping closing the critical ambition gap. And at the end of the day, our capital allocation decisions will ultimately have an impact on economic actors' cost of capital. Therefore, as too few private sector companies and organizations have embraced 1.5 degrees compatible decarbonization targets, and the policies issued by the public sectors do not yet manage to set the scene for such scenario, the finance sector can be a key catalyst for action. So earlier this year, Amundi was proud to join the Net Zero Asset Manager initiative in order to support the goal of global carbon neutrality by 2050. So what are we doing now? Very concretely, we are working on expanding our climate-related policy. This is key. We're working on supporting net zero-aligned investment across sectors and regions, including in emerging markets. We're working on ensuring that investors are equipped with efficient and ambitious climate investment strategies, as well as investment tools to support portfolios alignment and contribution. So how does this work in practice? When implementing net zero target on the investment side, we commit to develop a combination of alignment and contribution strategies across investment platforms, including in emerging markets. Alignment strategy for us means investing in a universe of companies, regardless of the sector or in each and every sector that compose the economy, in companies that are on a trajectory compatible with 1.5 to 2 degrees objective. The ultimate goal of this policy is to depreciate polluting activities and leverage carbon neutral ones. On the contribution side, this applies to companies and projects that actively contribute to limit global warming. And we believe this is also critical, as simply aligning financing flows might be not enough, and certain activities and technologies have yet to be developed and financed. The second critical dimension is the work on the companies we own, the ones which are in the portfolios we manage. Amundi engages with corporates on net zero objectives through our engagement, voting, and exclusion policies. These policies happen at 3 different levels. First, dialogue with companies on the adoption of net zero targets, such as the science-based targets. Second, exclusion of the most carbon-intensive energies, such as coal. We need to be very clear on this one. Coal is not compatible with net zero objective. Third, voting on climate resolution at the time of the General Assembly. So engaging companies to be on a climate neutral path will remain a key pillar of our climate strategies, and we intend to continue integrating emissions trajectories of the companies we invest in our ESG analysis. Third, mobilization at the corporate level. We believe that behind a commitment towards net zero and climate, there is a critical theory of change. So Amundi is committed to embrace change at every layer of its organization. We will ensure that this mission is shared throughout the organization, setting net zero targets for operations, empowering and training our staff to be actors of change, relying on our data and IT infrastructure to produce and disseminate relevant climate risk and impact analytics. Last but not least, climate engagement. As one cannot reach carbon neutrality without the global economy reaching carbon neutrality, asset managers alone cannot embark on net zero journey without convincing their clients. Let me conclude on a specific dimension which is really close to Amundi's heart and to my heart, why emerging market and developing economies are so critical in that fight against climate change, in that race against the clock. First, this push for carbon neutrality and improved environmental sustainability places a unique set of pressures on emerging markets. Emerging markets will account for the majority of electricity and energy demand over the coming decades as economies industrialize and grow. The energy transition will require us to address structural energy challenges in the EM space. EM matter as well because this is where our iPhone, electric scooters, and clothes are coming from. At the end of the day, CO2 emissions are embodied in international trade throughout the value chains. If you look at France's national emission of 749 million tons of CO2, 304 million tons of CO2 were imported. Much of these imported CO2 emissions coming, of course, from emerging markets where goods are produced, like Mexico, like China or India. So emissions in emerging markets need to be tackled as much as emissions in developed markets. Second, emerging market matters because growth in modern history has been coupled with increase in CO2 emissions. And has 2/3 of the global middle class now living in emerging markets. And with internal demand, which is now very much carbon intensive, we are facing a carbon intensive growth. Last but not least, and especially relevant when it comes to emerging markets, but also to developed markets, we need to make or to succeed in making a just transition. At Amundi, we strongly believe that climate goals will not only be achieved if the transition is socially acceptable. A just transition aims to minimize the negative social impact of a transition to a low-carbon world and maximize the positive impact, for example, on green job creation. Therefore, we as an asset manager and the investment community at large must engage investors through commitment policies and create funds integrating social criteria in their performance. We also need to set a clear methodological framework because there is no consensus on its definition to date. Europe is doing so now, and Amundi fully supports the green and upcoming social taxonomy and will support additional application overseas. So Amundi has been keen to support development in that area, notably by co-founding the Investors for a Just Transition Engagement Coalition. And if I have a call for action to make now, please join us. It is very important to also onboard investors overseas in that critical journey. To conclude, climate change is everyone's responsibility. Even though financial actors will not be able to radically shift the system on their own, as it is primarily a public policy issue to be dealt with by governments, they have an obvious role to play. Global greenhouse gas emissions need to drop now, and we have a collective responsibility to make that happen. Once again, thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them through the chat. I wish you a very nice day and end of the conference.